On the morning of March 28, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat down and composed what might be the most controversial telegram of World War II, addressed directly to Joseph Stalin. It contained just a few hundred words, but those words would determine the fate of Berlin, reshape the post-war world, and drive one of America's most aggressive generals absolutely furious. General George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing through Germany like a thunderbolt. His tanks had crossed the Rhine. His divisions were capturing territory at a pace that seemed unstoppable. And standing between Patton and Berlin, the ultimate prize, the capital of Hitler's crumbling Reich, was just 120 miles of broken, retreating German forces. Patton believed he could be there in days, perhaps a week at most, but Eisenhower's telegram changed everything. In it, he told Stalin that Berlin had lost its strategic importance. The Western Allies would halt at the Elbe River and drive southeast instead. The Soviet Union could have Berlin. Winston Churchill was outraged. Patton was devastated. And Bernard Montgomery, who had his own designs on the German capital, felt betrayed. This wasn't just a military decision. This was the moment the Cold War began, before World War II had even ended. But why did Eisenhower make this choice? What meeting? What agreement? What calculation stopped the greatest armored commander in American history from claiming the ultimate victory? And what would have changed if Patton had gotten his wish? The answer lies not in the spring of 1905, but months earlier, in a palace in Crimea, where three men divided up a continent that hadn't yet been conquered. To understand why Patton never got his chance at Berlin, we need to go back to February 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final act, but the curtain hadn't fallen yet. In the east, Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded 750,000 Soviet soldiers on the Oder River, just 35 miles from Berlin. To his south, Marshal Ivan Konev led another 500,000 troops. Together, they represented the largest concentration of military power the world had ever seen, poised like a coiled spring, ready to unleash hell on the German capital. In the west, things looked very different. Eisenhower commanded nearly 4 million men, but they were spread across a 450-mile front from the North Sea to Switzerland. They hadn't even crossed the Rhine yet. Berlin was over 300 miles away, but distance wasn't the real problem. From February 4th to 11th, 1945, the Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at the Levadia Palace in Yalta, Crimea. Roosevelt was visibly dying, his hands shaking, his face gaunt. Churchill was exhausted from 5 years of war. Stalin was exuberant. Knowing his armies were closing in on Berlin, they gathered to decide what would happen to Germany after the war. After days of negotiations, they agreed. Germany would be divided into 4 zones of military occupation. The British, French, and Americans would control zones in the west. The Soviets would occupy everything east of the Elbe River, and Berlin. Berlin would sit deep inside the Soviet zone, about 95 miles behind what would become the Iron Curtain. The city itself would be divided into 4 sectors, but it would be an island in a Soviet sea. Here's what's crucial. These zones weren't based on where armies ended up when the fighting stopped. They were drawn along administrative boundaries, agreed upon in advance. It didn't matter who captured what, the map was already decided. Did you know that this decision at Yalta essentially meant that even if American forces captured Berlin, they'd have to hand most of it over to the Soviets anyway? It was a gentleman's agreement made while the war still raged, and it would haunt the West for the next 45 years. But in March 1945, none of that mattered to George Patton. Patton was 59 years old, wearing his trademark ivory-handled revolvers, and he had just achieved one of the most stunning victories of the entire war. On March 22nd, his Third Army crossed the Rhine River near Oppenheim a full day before Montgomery's massive, meticulously planned crossing operation to the north. Patton did it with minimal casualties and maximum audacity. He then telephoned his superior, General Omar Bradley, and delivered one of the war's most famous lines. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Within 5 days, Patton's forces had shattered the German 7th and 1st Armies in the Sarpalatinate, capturing 68,000 prisoners, in what became known as one of the most devastating routs in military history. His tanks were averaging 25 to 30 miles per day. The Wehrmacht wasn't just retreating, it was disintegrating. To the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was methodically advancing, liberating the Netherlands and pushing toward the Baltic. In the center, General William Simpson's 9th Army was racing toward Magdeburg, and further south, Courtney Hodges' 1st Army had seized the bridge at Remagen, the last intact, crossing over the Rhine in a stroke of pure battlefield luck. By early April, the Allies had surrounded the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, capturing Field Marshal Walter Model's entire Army Group B, 400,000 men. Model, one of Hitler's most loyal commanders, ordered his youngest and oldest soldiers to go home, then walked into a forest and shot himself. The war was clearly ending. Every rational person could see it, but there was still Berlin, and Patton wanted it desperately. he wasn't alone. Montgomery believed capturing Berlin should be his reward for years of methodical, careful warfare. Simpson's Ninth Army, which had reached the Elbe on April 11 and established a bridgehead the next day, was only 60 miles from the German capital. Simpson repeatedly requested permission from Bradley to push forward. He believed he could be in Berlin within 48 hours. Even the British chiefs of staff were pushing for it. Field Marshal Alan Brooke wrote in his diary that Berlin remained of paramount importance and that political considerations should override purely military ones, but Eisenhower had made up his mind, and it wasn't just about Yalta. On March 28, 1945, Eisenhower sent his telegram to Stalin. It wasn't just a courtesy. It was a strategic declaration. Berlin is yours. The British exploded with rage. The British chiefs of staff were outraged on 3 grounds. First, Eisenhower had changed strategy without consulting the combined chiefs of staff, the body supposedly directing Allied operations. Second, by driving southeast instead of northeast toward Berlin, he was sidelining Montgomery and British forces in favor of American commanders like Patton and Hodges. Third and most damning, they argued Eisenhower had exceeded his authority by communicating directly with Stalin, bypassing political leadership. Churchill immediately fired off a message to the dying Roosevelt. If the Soviets take Berlin, he wrote, will not their impression that they have been the overwhelming contributor to our common victory be unduly imprinted in their minds? And may this not lead them into a mood which will raise grave and formidable difficulties in the future. Churchill saw what was coming. He already understood that the alliance with Stalin was temporary, that Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe were limitless, and that every piece of territory the Red Army occupied would become a bargaining chip or worse, a permanent Soviet possession. But Roosevelt wouldn't listen. The American president still believed in the possibility of post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union through the United Nations. He trusted Stalin, or at least, he wanted to believe he could trust him. Roosevelt would die just 2 weeks later. On April 12, never seeing how right Churchill had been, the American military leadership stood firmly behind Eisenhower. General George C. Marshall and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington refused to entertain British criticism. They pointed out 3 undeniable facts. First, Eisenhower was the supreme commander. He had the right to make operational decisions. Second, by spring 1945, the United States was providing 3/4 of the Allied war effort in Europe. American manpower, tanks, aircraft, and supplies dominated the battlefield. The British could protest, but they no longer had the leverage to overrule American strategy. Third, and this was the argument that carried the most weight. Berlin sat deep inside the Soviet zone agreed upon at Yalta. Why sacrifice American lives for a city they'd have to hand over anyway? Omar Bradley delivered the most brutal assessment. He told Eisenhower that taking Berlin could cost 100,000 American casualties. A pretty stiff price to pay, Bradley said, for a prestige objective. Did you know that Bradley's casualty estimate was probably exaggerated? The German forces defending Berlin were exhausted, under-equipped, and demoralized. Many intelligence officers believed Western forces could have entered the city with far fewer casualties than the Soviets ultimately suffered. But Bradley's number stuck, and it provided Eisenhower with the justification he needed. But there was another factor driving Eisenhower's decision, one that seems almost absurd in retrospect: the national redoubt. Allied intelligence was receiving reports fed partly by Nazi propaganda that Hitler's most fanatical SS troops were preparing to retreat to the Bavarian Alps. There, in an impregnable mountain fortress called the Alpen, they would wage a guerrilla war that could last for years. Hitler himself was supposedly already en route to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, ready to lead the resistance. That it was complete fiction. Heinrich Himmler had floated the idea in 1943, but Hitler never endorsed it. By 1945, the Wehrmacht could barely mount defensive actions, let alone organize a sophisticated Alpine resistance movement. But Eisenhower and his intelligence staff believed it, or at least, they couldn't afford to ignore the possibility. The idea of the war dragging on for months or even years, while Nazi fanatics held out in mountain bunkers, was too dangerous to dismiss. So Eisenhower made his choice: drive south and southeast, cut Germany in half, link up with the Red Army, eliminate the national redoubt, let the Soviets have Berlin. When Patton learned of the decision, he was furious. Patton had a deep, visceral hatred of the Soviets. He saw communism as an existential threat to Western civilization. Throughout April, as his Third Army drove into Czechoslovakia and Austria, he repeatedly requested permission to keep going to Prague, to Vienna, and yes, to Berlin. He never got it. On April 15, Eisenhower issued the order: all American armies would halt their eastward advance. Simpson's Ninth Army, sitting 60 miles from Berlin, with momentum and morale at their peak, was told to stop. Montgomery's forces in the north would advance only to secure the Baltic coast and prevent German forces from retreating into Denmark. Patton's Third Army would pivot south into Austria. The race for Berlin was over before it began. But what was happening in Berlin itself? By mid-April, the city was a nightmare. Adolf Hitler, now 56 years old, was living in his underground forebunker, ranting at generals who no longer had armies to command. He spent hours moving phantom divisions across maps, convinced that relief forces would arrive to save the capital. Above ground, 90,000 German soldiers, many of them teenagers from the Hitler Youth or old men from the Volkssturm Home Guard, prepared to defend the city. The SS execution squads were out in force, hanging defeatists from lampposts with signs around their necks, reading Ich bin ein Rechtsverräter, I am a national traitor. On April 16, the Soviets launched their assault. 9,000 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The bombardment was so intense that people 40 miles away reported feeling the ground shake. Stalin had personally created a competition between his two top commanders, Zhukov and Konev, to see who could reach Berlin first. He knew that whichever marshal planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag would become a national hero. The initial advance was brutal. German resistance was fiercer than expected. Soviet tank units, designed for open warfare, struggled in the urban environment. A single German soldier with a Panzerfaust could knock out a T-34 tank at close range. Soviet casualties mounted rapidly, but the Red Army had overwhelming numerical superiority and limitless artillery ammunition. By April 21st, they had broken through the last defensive lines. By April 25th, Berlin was completely surrounded. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped inside. The city was being blown apart, block by block, street by street, house by house. Soviet soldiers and German defenders fought for every building, every floor, every room. Women and children huddled in basements, terrified. The stories of what happened when Soviet soldiers found them stories of mass rape and brutality were horrific. Though little reported in the West at the time, on April 25, 1945, the same day Berlin was encircled, something extraordinary happened. 85 miles to the southwest. Soldiers from the U.S. 69th Infantry Division were patrolling along the Mulde River, a tributary of the Elbe. Around 11:30 a.m., they encountered horsemen, then Soviet officers, members of the 175th Rifle Regiment of the Red Army. The Americans and Soviets stared at each other for a moment. Then someone produced vodka. Toasts were drunk to Stalin, to Truman, to Churchill. The Americans offered cigarettes. Someone brought out a cup. There was dancing. Promises were made. Our nations will be friends forever. 2 days later, the event was restaged at Torgau on the Elbe for newsreel cameras. The footage went around the world. It was called the Spirit of the Elbe, the moment when East met West in the heart of a defeated Germany. That spirit would last approximately 8 months. On April 30, 1945, Soviet soldiers fought their way into the Reichstag, the bombed-out shell of Germany's parliament building. A sergeant named Meliton Kantaria and a junior lieutenant named Alexei Barost climbed to the roof and planted a Soviet banner. The photograph, later revealed to have been staged and retouched, became one of the most iconic images of World War II. That same day, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker. His body was burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden. The city surrendered 2 days later. On May 2nd, the Battle of Berlin had cost the Red Army dearly. More than 80,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. Over 250,000 were wounded. German casualties were even worse: 100,000 Berliners dead, most of them civilians. Marshal Zhukov called it one of the most difficult battles of the war. Eisenhower had been right about one thing: the battle for Berlin was absolute hell. But what if American forces had gone instead? Military historians have debated this question for 80 years. Could Patton or Simpson have reached Berlin before the Soviets? Could they have captured it with fewer casualties? The answer is complicated. On one hand, Simpson's Ninth Army was only 60 miles away. On April 12, they had momentum, fresh supplies, and high morale. German forces between the Elbe and Berlin were exhausted and demoralized. Many German soldiers, and certainly most German civilians, would have preferred to surrender to the Americans rather than face the Red Army. It's entirely possible that if Simpson had been given the order, his armored columns could have entered Berlin's outskirts within 48 to 72 hours. But this is Schatha. Soviets were not going to stop. Even if American forces had reached Berlin first, Zhukov's and Konev's armies would have kept coming. They had explicit orders from Stalin: take Berlin, no matter the cost. The city was their prize, their revenge for the 27 million Soviet citizens who had died in the war. What would have happened if American and Soviet forces both entered Berlin simultaneously? Would they have fought each other? Would there have been a tense standoff, guns pointed at former allies? We don't know, but the mere possibility was enough to make Eisenhower's blood run cold. And then there was Yalta. The agreement couldn't be ignored. If American forces captured Berlin, they would occupy it temporarily and then, per the agreement, withdraw most of their forces and hand over the Soviet sector. So what would have been gained? Prestige? Yes. Propaganda value? Absolutely. The ability to claim the Western Allies delivered the death blow to Nazi Germany, without question. But at what cost? Bradley's estimate of 100,000 casualties might have been high. But even if the real number was a quarter of that, 25,000 Americans killed or wounded, was Berlin worth it? Eisenhower didn't think so. His job was to end the war as quickly as possible with minimum casualties. He had another concern too: the Pacific. Japan hadn't surrendered yet. The atomic bomb was still being tested. Plans were underway for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that might not succeed until 1946. Eisenhower needed to preserve his forces and prepare for transfer to the Pacific Theater. Berlin could wait. But Churchill's warning echoed louder with each passing day. On July 16, 1945, during the Potsdam Conference, where the Big Three met again to finalize the post-war settlement, President Harry Truman received a coded message. The atomic bomb test in New Mexico had succeeded. Truman casually mentioned to Stalin that America now possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, who already knew about the Manhattan Project through Soviet spies, simply nodded and said he hoped it would be used against Japan. But the balance of power had shifted. America had the bomb. The Soviet Union had Berlin and half of Europe. Within months, the spirit of the Elba was dead. Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe was disappearing behind what Churchill would famously call the Iron Curtain. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all fell under Soviet control, and Berlin, in July 1945, as agreed at Yalta, British, American, and French troops arrived to occupy their designated sectors of the city. The Soviets didn't stop them. Berlin became a divided city inside a divided Germany inside a divided continent. But it could have been different. Let's talk about what actually happened after the decision was made. George Patton never got over it. In the months after the war, he became increasingly vocal in his anti-Soviet views. At a press conference in September 1945, he compared the Nazi Party to political parties in America, suggesting denazification was being taken too seriously. He was relieved of command of the Third Army, the force he had led to glory. On December 9, 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered a broken neck and died 12 days later at age 60. To this day, conspiracy theories persist that his death wasn't an accident, that someone wanted to silence his increasingly dangerous calls to confront the Soviet Union. William Simpson, the general whose Ninth Army came closest to Berlin, retired quietly after the war. He never spoke publicly about his disappointment, but those who knew him said he carried it with him for the rest of his life. Bernard Montgomery accepted a peerage and became Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He remained convinced until his death in 1976 that Eisenhower's strategy had been a mistake and that he, Montgomery, should have led a single, concentrated thrust to Berlin. And Churchill. On March 5, 1946, less than a year after the war ended, he delivered a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Standing beside President Truman, he declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." He had been right all along. The division of Berlin became the defining symbol of the Cold War. In June 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all road and rail access. The Western Allies responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies for 11 months until the Soviets backed down. In August 1961, East German workers under Soviet supervision began building a wall through the heart of the city. The Berlin Wall would stand for 28 years, dividing families, imprisoning millions, and serving as the most visible scar of a divided world. Did you know that in the months after the war, British military planners secretly drew up a plan called Operation Unthinkable? Requested by Churchill, it explored the feasibility of a surprise attack on the Soviet Union to impose the will of the United States and British Empire and liberate Poland. The plan was delivered on May 22, 1945. Its conclusion was stark: impossible. The Red Army's superiority in infantry and armor was overwhelming. Such a war would end in catastrophic defeat. The plan was filed away, but it revealed Churchill's desperation. He had watched the map of Europe being redrawn in red, and he knew the West had made a terrible mistake. The Americans weren't idle either. In 1945, they developed Plan Totality, one of the first nuclear war plans, targeting 20 Soviet cities for annihilation. By 1949, this had evolved into Operation Dropshot, a comprehensive strategy for World War III that envisioned dropping 300 nuclear weapons and 250,000 tons of conventional bombs to destroy 85% of Soviet industrial capacity. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were serious military plans, drawn up because Western leaders realized they had ceded too much ground in 1945. Would things have been different if Patton had taken Berlin? Almost certainly yes, but not in the way you might think. If American forces had captured Berlin first, the psychological and propaganda impact would have been enormous. The Soviet Union would have been denied its greatest World War II victory, the image of the red flag over the Reichstag. Western troops would have discovered the four-bunker Hitler's body, the final secrets of the Nazi regime. The newsreels and photographs would have shown American and British soldiers as the conquerors of Nazi Germany. But here's what wouldn't have changed. The Yalta agreements. American forces would still have been required to withdraw from the Soviet sector. The city would still have been divided. Stalin would still have occupied Eastern Europe. However, in this is crucial. Western military presence established in Berlin from day one would have given the Allies immense leverage in negotiations. The Soviets would have arrived at Potsdam not as sole conquerors of the capital, but as partners sharing a city already administered by Western forces. The infrastructure, the records, the symbolic heart of the German state would have been in Allied hands. The Berlin blockade of 1948 might have been impossible. The construction of the wall in 1961 might have been politically untenable. The entire dynamic of the early Cold War could have been different, but Eisenhower didn't make his decision lightly. He was a professional soldier with millions of men under his command. His first responsibility was to their lives, and from a purely military standpoint, driving southeast to cut Germany in half, eliminating the threat of the national redoubt, and linking up with Soviet forces away from the political complications of Berlin. It made sense. The problem is that war is never purely military. There's a moment in history, a brief window, when the entire world balanced on a knife's edge. It came in April 1945, when American tanks sat 60 miles from Berlin, engines idling, crews ready, waiting for an order that never came. The decision not to take Berlin was militarily sound but strategically catastrophic. Eisenhower saved American lives in the short term but locked the West into a defensive posture that would last 45 years. He honored an agreement made with an ally he was already beginning to mistrust. History remembers Eisenhower as a brilliant coalition commander, a man who held together fractious allies and delivered victory. He was right that the battle for Berlin would have been brutal. He was right that the Yalta agreements had already drawn the borders. He was even right that the propaganda value of capturing Hitler's capital wasn't worth the blood it would cost. But Churchill was right. The decision to halt at the Elbe didn't just end World War II, it began the Cold War. Every piece of territory the Red Army occupied became a Soviet possession. Every city they liberated became a prison. The Iron Curtain didn't descend across Europe by accident. It fell along the lines where armies stopped in the spring of 1945. George Patton understood this. His hatred of the Soviets was visceral, even irrational at times, but he saw what was coming. He wanted to drive through Berlin and keep going all the way to Moscow if necessary. His superiors thought he was crazy. History suggests he might have been right. Could Patton have taken Berlin alone? Probably not. Simpson's Ninth Army was closer and better positioned, but could Western forces have reached it first? Almost certainly yes. Would it have changed the outcome of the war? No. Germany was finished regardless of who captured its capital. But would it have changed the Cold War? Yes, absolutely yes. The tragedy is that we'll never know what that different world might have looked like. A world where American tanks rolled into Berlin first, where the Reichstag was captured by the Ninth Army, instead of the Red Army, where the first images of victory in Europe showed American soldiers, not Soviet ones, raising their flag over Hitler's ruined capital. What we do know is this. The Allied meeting that stopped Patton, the conference at Yalta in February 1945, wasn't just about winning the war. It was about deciding what came after. And in that decision, made before Berlin had even been threatened, the fate of Europe was sealed. When the Berlin Wall finally fell on November 9, 1989, it had been standing for 10,316 days. Families had been divided for nearly 3 decades. Lives had been destroyed. People had been shot trying to cross from east to west. All of it might have been different if one order had been given differently in April 1945. Patton never got his chance at Berlin. The decision was made in a palace in Crimea, confirmed in a telegram to Stalin, and executed by generals who believed they were making the right call. They won the war, but in doing so, they may have lost the peace.